We can start when you're ready, Roger.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, this is the closing session. So first of all, I think just to reflect back on really quite an extraordinary collection of sessions and speakers that we've had over the last 3 days, covering really quite wide territory, as it were, in relation to recovery, which does reflect the nature of the project. But what I'd like to do is just give a few points of reflection based on some things people have said, other things that are, me reflecting on what people have said and how that relates and possibly extends the sort of work we've been doing in the Recovery with Dignity project. Then I'd like to invite those members of the advisory panel who are on the call just to say a few more words if they wish to. It's an invitation, not a necessity, and then open it to really any other participants, members of the team and other attendees. So let me just start then with just a few thoughts. So I think one of the things that I really liked about how this was put together, and particularly by Garima and her colleagues at IIHS, is the way the sessions have progressed from looking at the sort of policy dilemmas, the issues around approaches and gaps in recovery. I think really sort of setting out the problem over the first day and a half around needs and approaches and particular issues around planning, coordinating, avoiding, if we can plan in the long, for long term and be prepared in advance to have systems in place to plan recovery in advance. We can avoid some of the ad hoc decision making, some of the opportunism and even corruption that creeps into the post hazard phase, I would call it. We've also heard about inconsistency in how things are approached, and I think Kamal particularly made the point about how recovery from small scale events is an even more neglected field. Recognizing that recovery is not the same as reconstruction, that it goes much further than that, and the barriers to achieving that, however, are quite fundamental in society, and we need to recognize that at the same time as we challenge it. The need for a much more integrated approach across sectors, including attention to environmental restoration, and particularly attention to well-being and psychosocial dimensions. And to create a sort of a long-term thinking that gives more actors the opportunity to feed in. But again, recognizing that that's at odds with the shorter term project type approach. And thanks Mark for the phrasing there. So that was kind of, in a way, setting the context, and a lot of discussion around that. But in some ways, that's the sort of, although still not discussed enough, that's still the sort of standard territory really of discussion and debate around recovery. And so what was great was the way we moved through into the second half. What I think is really the core focus of this particular initiative, Recovery with Dignity, which is to focus on how we think about it, how we speak about, how we convey ideas about recovery. Whether that does or does not reflect how the most vulnerable, most disaster-affected people themselves think about the process and the implications of that for practice. So there's a couple of things really that I want to particularly focus on that I came especially out of today. And one of the things that we went into the study of Recovery with Dignity, we knew that there was this sort of gap around the psychosocial. What's been fascinating here is to hear so many people talk about it and refer to it, and the importance of it. And I think it just underlines how key it is, and that we continue to challenge the relative neglect of this aspect. The fact that even events that happened a very long time ago, the rippling effect in terms of livelihoods, but particularly in terms of those emotional dimensions, continues through time, because very often there's such enormity of the event itself. One of the things that I was thinking about earlier, and it is something that I've talked particularly with Teresa and others about, who I'm not sure if Teresa is on the call right now in the session, but it's how we actually, it's very easy for as an external observer to just think of a hazard and think of that, little event that's taken place and that awfully hazardous place that people live in. But how people conceive of the source of a hazard, how they connect emotionally with it is really complex, because of course, in many cases, is the connection people had with that as a pre-existing resource. So something that was in normal times benevolent, maybe even majestic, like the sea, like a river, like a volcano. And I think one can even extend that slightly less sort of dramatic, but to the idea of land and soil as something that gives. And then when you have a drought, it ceases to give. So, how does that notion of hazard play out in how people then conceive of their territory and what matters to them? Is there perhaps a sense of somehow being betrayed by that resource? We've talked a lot, and I think it's really important that we've talked a lot, because not many people do, about the importance of recreation of shared cultural symbols in the recovery process. We've talked about the value of creative arts and helping people work through and remembering in the long term, though recognizing there may be situations where people don't want to be encouraged to remember, and we have to just respect what people want. And the role of objects as an entry point was emphasized by Alex. I think is really, it's an understudied and perhaps underused element of this. But then also, we have to, with all these things, we have to have some sorts of caveats, and thinking about the ability of grassroots artistic groups to perform this function. Yes, we may celebrate the fact that they may be the most appropriate to do it, but they, being rooted in the places where disasters have taken place, they've also been affected. Some may have lost their lives. Fundamentally, they can no longer take part in those artistic support services, so to speak. But the whole, the infrastructure of those may need support. So we need to recognise that. And then from the last session, the ideas around alternate means by which to both achieve a voice and to achieve grassroots action. And we've heard, I think, quite a lot about how, local networks, that if they have a mindset that's genuinely committed to grassroots action, then it can be really effective. So Bijoy's example of local radio, Lecture Me on the Chekuti dolls, both Alex and Shalini in their passionate discussion of the role of museums, and Mary's work in environmental restoration in Timbuktu. But then, a key point underlined by Divya, that you may need to go further. You may need to use this phrase, insurgency, as a tactic for those excluded. That actions may be needed to bring power, to draw power to themselves, rather than try to break into kind of pre-existing closed circles of power and authority. So what does all this mean for practice, as well as for what we focus on in terms of research? Well, yeah, we've fundamentally, many have argued there needs to be a shift towards a much more rights-based approach to recovery, recognizing it as a right, not an act of receiving charity, and framing it much more in terms of justice. And Shalini was particularly impassioned about that particular aspect, but it's something that's cut through a lot of the talks about shifting the balance of power. And and I think really key, particularly in relation to the themes of this workshop and our project is this concept of recognition justice. So recognizing that the voices of those who are typically marginalized truly matter, recognizing capacities, recognizing agencies, and then bringing people into a process of decision making about where, if those decisions are ones that will affect them. I will say this though: we have to retain a criticality, particularly as researchers, but in all walks. We have to avoid assumptions, and we have to recognise that perspectives are not uniform. They're not uniform amongst those who have hold of the reins of power. They're not uniform in the media, and they're not uniform in communities. I mean, one of the concepts that we've often, or one of these terms we've often used when discussing our work, is to talk about dominant representations. But then when we're asked to define what we mean by dominant representations, it's not always easy. So I think, we have to be a little bit careful about how we express that and acknowledge that the problem is not entirely external to people. Yes, we need to shift the balance much, much, much more to those to whom the balance should fundamentally be shifted, which is those most vulnerable, those most affected. But we also heard about adverse representation, so to speak, that generated by people themselves, seeing themselves as so much in need that they will, people will deny their own agency in effect. Or maybe it's a different form of agency, but, not undertake recovery actions because that would undermine the possibilities of getting aid. So it's a really fine balance to strike, I think, in this whole, the way that we talk about recovery with dignity. It's a balance between valuing and supporting people's own agency, but not using that as power brokers could potentially use that as a sort of get out excuse to leave people to get on with it. And that's something that I'm really conscious of. We have to be careful. So we celebrate agency, but we also recognize that people need supporting in order to exercise that agency in many cases, to be able to self-recover. And in providing support, make sure that support is meaningful, it's appropriate, it's welcome, and that it's not delivered in a disempowering way. So those are my thoughts. So nice to see these being captured like that in the drawings. That's wonderful. So can I let me see. So can I ask? So for those of you who are not directly associated with the project, we have quite a large project team, but we have a series. We have a set of people who have functioned as advisors. I don't think we've called on them on their advice and expertise enough during the course of the project, and that is in part because we had so many uncertainties with the latter stages when COVID hit. But I'd like to give them a chance, and some I think certainly several have spoken today. First of all, I think the first I can see is Alex. Would you have anything you'd like to add? You don't have to, but I kind of have put you on the spot, really, haven't I?
You have, thank you. It's been fantastic to be part of this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens next. But just what you've said about people needing support in order to exercise their agency, I think that's a really, really important thing. And it's something that, just going back to having a museum-y sort of hat on, often in co-production, I think people don't understand that enough, that you need to be given some sort of assistance in order, or no, that's the wrong word. But I just think it's a really important point. But who gives that support? What is that support? Where's it coming from? I think there are so many more questions there. But
I often think of it as it's about being facilitative, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're not facilitating what you want people to express. It's facilitating that voice.
absolutely. But I think that it's really, really important, as I've said, that to use creative means of doing that, and experimenting and telling stories, using things, making things. That's probably all I'm going to say.
Thank you, Alex. That's great. Shalini, do you want to reflect further?
Well, I think the only point that I think I would like to add to this is in terms of what would these stories lead to? I mean, so it's one thing, the initiatives have happened, their actions have happened, which have drawn power to themselves and, basically challenge the power that they are, but also, creating alternative templates of how the disaster recovery process could have happened. But when one is looking at disasters which are unfolding over decades, and different kind of political systems are coming in and coming out, I think it is also important to see, to also trace the lack of recovery in some unconventional manner, not just tracing recoveries. So both presence and absence. And I think with long drawn disasters, it is a challenge. I don't have answers for it, but it is a point I wanted to put for reflection. Because as a teacher, one of the challenges that I find is it is great to create stories, but how do we take stories to schools? Which run a curriculum that is state approved. One can keep creating parallel curriculum, and one will never be able to make inroads into the community because community does not have access to these parallel curriculums. So not putting it as an existential crisis, but this is a struggle that we, I think, as a scholar activist face. What do you do with this knowledge, and how do you incorporate it in the established institutional and educational frameworks so that it actually brings a bottom-up change in some ways?
Yeah, and it does require you to have networks, in effect, of committed, trusted people within those institutions that can enable that.
Yeah.
Look, great, thank you, Shalini. I'm delighted to give Lena the opportunity. Lena Zambrano is based at Universidad de Manizales in Colombia, and I think I'm right that Hazel will be happy to translate. I always forget, is it translate or interpret?
Interpret if it's, well, either, I think.
Okay, please, Lena.
Lina, Roger te invita a comentar o tus reflexiones sobre el taller, si quieres, no estás obligada, pero si quisieras, si deseas ofrecer algunas reflexiones, ya.
Muchas gracias, Roger, por la pregunta. En realidad he estado fascinada con lo que he escuchado, he aprendido, reafirmado. Me parece interesantísimo cómo la vivencia de la recuperación y de los desastres que hemos tenido hasta ahora nos han invitado a repensar todas las esferas que tiene el ser humano y cómo la parte cultural, la construcción de símbolos culturales está teniendo la fuerza necesaria para estar inclusive dentro de escenarios de...
Traducir hasta ahora, perdón, Lina. Traduzco hasta ahora. I'm just going to translate so far because I can't, otherwise I'll forget. But Lina says it's been fascinating, really interesting, how to listen to so much about how living through disasters makes us really think again about human beings. And about the role of culture and symbols in our lives and in recovery. Perdón, Lina, ya, continúa.
También estaba queriendo decir de cómo invita a hacer una sola ciencia y no estar fragmentados. Entonces, te voy diciendo por partes.
Lina, que no escuché la primera parte, perdón, repites. I didn't hear the first thing that she said, sorry. La primera parte no escuché. Nos
La
invita.
Nos invitan a un trabajo interdisciplinario, o sea,
Okay.
a una sola ciencia, no fragmentar.
Okay, yeah. So we're invited to work in an interdisciplinary way and not from the perspective of a single science or discipline. Yeah.
Y crearle una nueva significación a la política pública desde los proyectos comunitarios.
And to give new meaning to policies, public policies, from the perspective of communities.
Y también resaltar el valor que tiene la voz de la comunidad en cada una de las acciones que se quieren hacer para planear y ejecutar una recuperación.
And to highlight the value of community voices in the planning and recovery from disasters.
Y lógicamente felicitar al equipo por todo el esfuerzo que han hecho durante estos 3 años que van a ser muy fructíferos. Gracias.
And she'd like to congratulate the team for the work that's been going on for the last 3 years, which has been very productive. Thank you. Gracias, Lena.
Gracias, Lena. And let me just sort of say a little bit about Lena's work. So Hazel and I have been working with Lena over, well, I've now several years in Colombia, but the project we've been, well, a series of projects we've been doing over the last few years has been working with people who've been displaced by violence in Colombia and now reside in informal settlements in places that are often very prone to landslides. So it's a project that we've called Moving with Risk, from one form of risk to another. And Lena and her team, who are sort of background mostly in social psychology, brought I will say this wonderful creativity to the approaches of working with communities, a wonderful sense of commitment, finding so many ways to get people involved that went beyond the sort of the norm of which a research project does, as well as using creative methods of engagement. You know, they had me cycling around a village. We were giving out invitations to a public meeting by hand, talking to people as we did so. The children were gathering. Of course, it was, you know, it turned into, well, that's a lovely experience, of course, but putting that bit more extra effort in, it sort of broke down barriers and we had so many more people coming, and that was just the start. So, you know, Lena's work continues with, you know, to have this very sort of creative energy brought in to how we communicate with people. And a very strong thing right from the start was that we weren't going to do they weren't including interviews. We were doing conversaciones with people, conversations. And in fact, Alex, it was possibly even influenced by your work if we trace back, but we did quite often use objects as a start point for the conversation. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that, and yeah, it's been wonderful. We hope to continue that work. Can I now then, I think there's any other members of the advisory panel here. So I'd like to now open it up to really to any interventions from anybody, any comments, reflections from those present attendees and from the project team that you'd like to add on top of the things that have been saying, maybe something that stimulated, you know, new thoughts or a critique of what people have said. So any, can people just raise their hand and speak if they wish to? Is that, sorry, IHS team, is that an option here?
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't have to type in the chat. If you prefer to, you can raise your hand and we'll open the mic. How about somebody from the project team just to kick us off? When I say kick us off, I mean start us off. Sorry.
Amrita's got her hand up.
Hello.
Hi, Amrita.
Hi. So like I've been through from the first day of the workshop and also been a part of the team. I have a few reflections that I want to share. I think the project and the workshop both kind of answers many questions that they have themselves started like looking for. Like there has been the research questions and they've answered quite a number of them through the process of the research and the workshop. I think first, I think the concept of inclusiveness in terms of discipline, in terms of like bringing multiple disciplines together, a number of practitioners, like people from theory, people from the field themselves. It has been absolutely like fascinating for me to see all of them in a shared platform. And like the most intriguing thing for me has been the usage of the term dignity, bringing in it in something in a whole project, or the coinage of it, I would like to say. Like I think the term dignity has been studied from the point of view of political economics, social science, legal justice, but it's difficult to conceptualize it or theorize it because it's an extremely intangible category and it's also kind of subjective. But also bringing in the concept in the context of recovery, I think it is extremely brave and empowering to the people who really needs some agency there. And thirdly, like just bringing a person from history into the whole idea of this inquiry has been, I think, extremely brave for that, and I've learned a lot. And something I would end by saying, I think I've always wondered, where are we located as a country, as a whole community, to do a volume of work like Partition of India, where the number of projects, the number of oral history workshops, the museum endeavors, also the number of people who work on it has empowered a lot of people who have suffered from the traumas of partition. The volume of work has been empowering. I've often wondered, how are we located as a community to do the same volume of work, to give voice back to the people who have suffered from multiple disasters. And I kind of feel this is a very good, it's a positive point. Like, where are we ending today? That we have started off towards that, I think. And that has been extremely positive, and it's a main takeaway from the whole workshop. Thank you.
Oh, it's lovely to hear. Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, there's a lot still to do. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask here and failing. I'll finish talking and then I'm trying to add a link in the chat for Andrew, but it's only going to the panelists so far. Yeah, I think I wouldn't say it's correct that we stumbled on the word dignity, but it was, we were thinking about how to frame this, and it just, yeah, it encapsulates so much. Of course, there's so many sort of questions one can ask, but in a way that's the beauty of the title, because it can have multiple things. But inherently, it's recognizing that people are owed dignity, and it's recognizing the need that that their dignity is often undermined. So, yeah, so pleased with that. I think we've scratched the surface, and it would be great to do further work on this. We had, we intended to do much more community-based engagement work, exhibition work, and so on, which we planned to do, but that COVID prevented us from doing. So if we can find opportunity to do that, it would be great. So has anyone else put their hand up?
Roger, there's one attendee called Jyoti.
Yeah, Jyoti.
Jyoti, would you like to?
Jyoti, please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Jyoti Krishnan. I'm speaking from Kerala, from Trivandrum in Kerala. I couldn't attend all the panel sessions, but I did listen to a few. And yesterday there was discussion on how the post-disaster scene is dominated by infrastructure-driven reconstruction and gives less emphasis on recovery. So coming from where I do, and not just Kerala, but India, we know that this is true, that the state continues to give emphasis on infrastructure-driven recovery processes. But I would just like to know whether, is there a shift in thinking within international aid agencies or other governments in this country, where there is recognition of giving more importance to the process of long-term recovery, which then would compel them to look at pre-disaster vulnerabilities? So that was my question. Thank you for the very well-organized workshop.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I got caught up then in attempting to multitask. Someone in the rest of the team care to answer the question, please?
I don't have an, shall I say, Roger?
Please do, yes.
Yeah. Jyoti, thank you for that very, very important question. I don't have a positive answer to give to you. I think what we have learned and used in context of disasters in India is to do exact opposite. So one of the big lessons, for example, I spoke about Bhopal. So one lesson from Bhopal should have been to increase corporate accountability and to not rely on their processes and to not uncritically trust expert science, expertise, outsider expertise. But what we find is, first through spatial economic zone process, now through smart city and infrastructural corridor kind of schemes that Government of India is doing, the lesson is that it's absolutely the opposite. So yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't have a positive response to your question, but I just wanted to, share my empathy with the question and from where you were coming. We haven't seen the reversal. And this we are seeing in case of COVID also, the back and forth between Kerala model and Gujarat model and, all other kind of models. So what would happen to really change the structure in a way that it includes disaster, it includes recovery as a pre-disaster consideration rather than a post-disaster consideration? I'm less optimistic about it.
Yeah. Thank you, Shalini.
Sorry, Jyoti. I think yes. I mean, it's true, and there's in some contexts, I'm sure there's been a retrenchment. I think there are signs, but it's and these are the things. I think I was asking this in the first session when we had people from various different organisations, making sort of critical statements about what was needed. Are there signs of things that are changing? And of course, we've heard a lot about things happening at grassroots level, but in terms, nationally. I would say internationally, there's at least a recognition. There are more interventions now, maybe not long term, but short term, around psychosocial dimensions. And I think after the tsunami, that was what really triggered it. Clearly not enough, and it's clearly not. It still needs to be far more. So, has there been a shift? No. Has there been some sort of movement? Yes, I think there has in many cases. In certain situations, politically, yes, you're going to get a retrenchment, and I'm sure that's the case, Shalini. And I would say it's an interesting story, COVID in Britain, because we have a fairly right-wing government, and when it hit, suddenly there was this celebration of public services and the wonderful job they do under such terrible conditions, underinvestment for years by those same politicians. But now I think we're at this sort of stage where the political act now is to celebrate coming out of, doing really well by stealing all the world's vaccine supplies and coming out of it, and the sorts of hollow promises made about strengthening other aspects are not going to happen, and we're being, Britain's recovery is being seen as something led by business interests. So particularly the travel sector thing. So yeah, this could easily turn into a kind of a general non-expert sort of rant about these things. But I think there are signs, and things like the Sendai framework and its predecessor, the Hyogo framework, they're helping to shift things. More and more people I speak to in institutions have that kind of mindset, but putting that into action is much harder. Question from Sayana, I think, or a comment.
Hi.
Hi there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So I'm calling in from Kerala today. And thank you so much for organizing this workshop and sharing all your findings. I'm currently working with Lisa Bornstein, who was one of the panelists yesterday, and I'm working with her on the Adapter project, where we focus on climate adaptation and disaster recovery in Latin America. And I found it extremely interesting how there were so many very similar findings across both your work here in India, as well as what the Adapter team is doing in Latin America. So that was really interesting for me to hear of and watch and attend over the past few days with you guys. So one of the points that has been made both in Adapter and here with Recovery with Dignity has been the gap between policy and execution of things on the ground level, at grassroots level. And as Shalini just mentioned, there's always here in Kerala, and I guess like in many places in India, we're very focused on infrastructural interventions in terms of when it comes to recovery and post-disaster actions. So I guess my reflection and maybe my question, or just like a thought that I'd like to put out there, is how can we scale the gap between the policies? And there are very many great policies, but with India being so vast, so multicultural and so huge, and with such a massive population, there's definitely no one size fits all solution. And how do we kind of bridge that gap between policies and execution on the ground level? Yeah,
that's always the 6 million, whatever your currency you choose, question, isn't it? And there is, of course, no easy answer. I mean, one thing is to engage with such stakeholders at policy level, to in a way that recognize. I think this is the sort of the recognition and respect as element comes in there. Not if there are people that appear to be motivated to do a good job, and let's face it, some are. It's then recognizing the constraints they work under and trying to demonstrate ways to work with that and through that. So I think I do think demonstration of different ways of working can be very effective in that sense, as well as alongside sort of normal advocacy. I'm sure other people have got some thoughts on that, particularly in the Indian context. Is there anything there? I was just checking the chat to see if anyone said anything there. No.
Nothing.
Yes, Mark.
Yeah, well, I was just, I can't remember what session it was discussed, but just, I think picking up on, I really wish I could remember who was talking about it, but I guess the need to take a longer term view and to really try and prioritize to do things a bit more slowly. So, I mean, it doesn't directly address the question of how to make or how to kind of close a gap between policy and implementation, but I think as much as possible, trying to ensure that there are good structures in place in advance of crisis periods is one way in which you can try and facilitate or certainly create the conditions by which there's more chance that we can enable a better recovery for populations and people that are affected. So I think there are certain things that you can do, kind of structural things, to try and enable, I guess, enable the policies to work, as well as those more localized steps, localized action. And I think the other thing we need to accept is, almost regardless of the size of the country or regardless of the number of people that live in a country, that there's going to be huge variation in performance. So I guess it's building as much as possible, building redundancies into systems, recognizing that in some places one way of doing something will work better, that in other places won't work. So adopting, I would say, more of a patchwork approach to try and really be cognizant of what's working where and in what context, rather than, I think, as is the case with lots of, I guess, that big kind of state level policy measures, is a much more kind of blanket approach. So they would be my two thoughts around that issue.
Okay. And it's something that we noted it in the one of the briefing documents that's on the on one of the web resources, was there's almost an assumption that you don't plan for recovery, and questioning that, that actually that you can put if you're in a place, a context where there are regular hazards, why not put effort into thinking about planning and strengthening capacity for recovery planning? Not in a fixed way, because you can't be sure what's going to happen, but you have their sort of institutional mechanisms in place. So that's what we thought. But one of the things that I tried to do at that time was to look for examples to show it, and it was really difficult. I mean, I worked on a project a few years back for the Red Cross on capacity strengthening in disaster management, and it was one aspect I couldn't find. There was very little active capacity strengthening work being done by external organizations, so NGOs and INGOs and UN organizations, that was focusing on recovery capacity. And I think it's something that needs to be explored more with disaster management institutions, but also would really benefit from some examples of where it's actually taken place. And this is why I was getting at the demonstration thing. Anyone in public policy faces so many hurdles, but so if we can find ways to actually say, yeah, that is a hurdle, but look, this is a way you can actually get over it. I think that's extremely powerful. Mohit, can we open them? Okay. Yeah. Hi there. Mohit, can you open your mic, or I don't know if you have.
Yes. Hello.
Hi there.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, and thank you so much for this wonderful, insightful workshop. I couldn't attend all the session, but I attend some 4 sessions, but I just wanted to add this one point there. This one point is also very important, to include the aspect of culture in the recovery process. Because like last session yesterday Malini Bhattacharya was discussing about the aspect of culture. Without including the aspect of culture, I think the people feel a double disaster. One that has already happened, and the second one is loss of their sentiments and I think the trauma they feel after the disaster. So include in the recovery process, the culture aspect is also important, I think. And thank you.
Yes, and I think, mate, that's come across very strongly in this workshop, and it reflects the nature of what we're talking about. But yes, I think it's a message we should continue to try to get across. Is a question from Shalini? You got your hand up, I believe.
Yes, so I just wanted to respond to an earlier point about psychosocial aspects of recovery, which I think you also mentioned, and someone just asked, put a comment also in the chat box. I think one very important point to highlight here is that in India, the Disaster Management Act and the National Mental Health Act have no dialogue with each other at the policy level. So I just wanted to put it out there, because if people are interested in psychosocial aspects, yes, we can do and we should do work in terms of documenting what communities are experiencing and what have been the short-term, long-term psychosocial aspects, but also how the, because, you know, mental health impacts do not happen overnight. They progress, and one form of disorder transforms into another disorder over a period of time. So we have two big policies. One is on disaster management and the other is on mental health, but they are not in dialogue with each other, neither in consultation nor in terms of their content. So people who are interested in that kind of work, I think, should also look into those policies very closely. Because that's a policy level intervention we can at least strive for, you know, putting pressure to bring two national policies in dialogue with each other.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's something very tangible one can do to make sure those connections are made. I noticed there's a question in the Q&A. I don't know who it's from. The question is, does productivity have any place in this conversation about recovery? Can the person that asked the question identify themselves? Because I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. If you can raise your hand. Oh. Was that say? Krishna. Was it Krishna?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Krishna. So could you rephrase your question? So when you say productivity, what do you mean?
I mean output. Output in any avocation that the person is engaged in. Unless recovery is complete, he will not be able to be as active in his profession as he would otherwise.
Sure. Yeah, that's...
I attended a few sessions and I didn't hear this word at all. So I was wondering whether it was relevant or not, in your view.
I'll try and come in, I think, on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically, I think we had a very long conversation, in fact, on the first day, third session, which was looking at disaster recovery policies and priorities. And I think one of the questions that we put as a collective, we put this question to a member from the National Disaster Management Authority who was there with us that day, and we asked this question that, you know, at present we know that, you know, recovery doesn't necessarily get covered in the existing Disaster Management Act, for instance, and we don't have a comprehensive recovery policy. So if in case we do intend to have one, what form should it take? And his response was actually very interesting, and I think in a way it addresses the point that you're also raising, Krishna, here. And it connected with some of the other inputs that had come in by then, was this idea of not output but really outcome of recovery. And I think it came from this approach that, and this recognition that, you know, recovery per se is not going to be, we will not be able to achieve recovery as such by, you know, having one agency or one institution being able to do it, and it has to be done collectively by different people. And I think what Mark just said, you know, it's sort of like a jigsaw of different things need to come together. And what his idea was that what the NDMA member who was with us, and Krishna Kamal Kishore, and he essentially said that, you know, there needs to be an long-term outcome based approach where all the inputs that go in have a longer term view, have a longer term engagement with the place, with the people, so that there is an ongoing kind of assessment and ongoing recognition of what's working and what's not working in the form of recovery, and in a way also brings together the people, brings together the voices of what is really required. And of course, the fact that and I think one of these other ideas that we've been talking about here is that recovery can't be a 3-month or a 6-month process. It has to be a long-term engagement. And we've also seen from other cases where it has happened. I mean, we've seen that in Nagapattinam, for instance. We've seen in Timbuktu Collective. We've seen in plenty of other cases where engaging with people for a long term has actually led to certain consistent outcomes. And obviously we can't go in with a biased idea of what people need, because the needs themselves change over time, and the risks themselves are not non-linear. They reach a sort of tipping point in a non-linear way, and then when it crashes, I mean, when the system breaks, we just it tends to be sudden, but then once it breaks also there'll be new things that will emerge. So we have to go in with that recognition and that modesty, first of all, to know that we probably don't know everything when we are beginning that process. So I don't know if it really answers the question of productivity in recovery, but definitely the outcome-based approach and a place-based approach in that sense was something that we definitely did touch upon. And in all honesty, I mean, if that's the approach we were to take at a national policy level, I think it would be definitely a good step towards the right direction. Yeah, I think at this point I will leave it that.
Okay, thank you, Garima. I note, Lena, you've got a question? And Hazel, if you can be on standby.
Bueno, no es una pregunta, sino algo para aportar en el tema psicosocial.
So it's not really a question, but something to add to the topic of psychosocial support.
Quiero tomar algo que nombraba ahora Mark sobre la necesidad de un cambio estructural en la sociedad.
So she wants to take up something that Mark said about the need for a change, un cambio en la estructura social, a change in the social structure.
Y pudiéramos iniciar en los procesos de formación de lo psicosocial. O en los
we could work into our training of people training in psychosocial support could have this incorporated into their training.
Shalini hablaba de las normas están diferentes en salud mental y en gestión del riesgo, no coinciden.
So Shalini was talking about how the how psychosocial support and disaster risk management don't come together very much.
En Latinoamérica estamos teniendo un dilema, no sé si en la India también, pero la psicología está ubicada para las normas, para las leyes en salud, pero nosotros creemos que es más de las ciencias sociales.
So at the moment in Colombia, the legislation sees psychosocial support as part of mental health, but they see it as having a place in the social sciences as well.
Y por lo tanto, se lee lo psicosocial solamente para la intervención psicológica mental y no para la lectura colectiva.
So psychosocial support is seen as something only for the mental health and not something for collective participation and well-being. Perdón, te interrumpí, pero...
Y la idea sería pensar de cómo formar profesionales desde la psicología para que también aporten en los aspectos sociales, no solo haciendo terapia, sino aportando todo lo de gestión del riesgo.
So the challenge is to train people in psychosocial support, but not just for therapy and for mental health problems, but for social support in communities. that was Lena's comment. Gracias, Lena, muy interesante.
Thank you very much, Lena, and thanks, Hazel, for translation, as wonderful as that is. Thank you. I'm going to draw it to a close. Shalini, you still got your hand up, or is it from a previous? Is it an artifact of a previous one?
Yeah, I think it's fossilized now. I'm going to remove it. I didn't remember.
Okay. All right. So I think I'm going to draw to a close now. So I just, thank you very much. And that's actually been a really rich conversation, and it's great to have the opportunity to do that and to talk to you all. I'd like to, express our sincere hope to be able to continue doing work of this nature, both in India and in other countries. It's in the UK, the funding situation has just got a lot worse, but there are still possibilities, and it's something that we're committed to try to build further research projects as we can. So I think all I'll say now is that the project has got another, where are we now? July, a couple of months to run. And we are busy finalizing a whole series of outputs, and clearly some will continue afterwards, some of the more academic ones. But the website is there. We're going to keep building on it. So I hope it's useful, and I hope you'll continue to access it in future. So what I'd like to say then is my sincere thanks to all the participants, and particularly those who've been through every session, and particularly those who are doing it at night time, like Lena. Thank you so much, everybody. And particular thanks to the IIHS team for wonderful organization, very professional and efficient. And so thanks to all of you, particularly Garima, who's been leading the process, Garima Jain, but also to Gargi, Venita, Amrita, Maitili, Nihal, I'm not sure who else is here, but anyway, yes, and if I've missed you, I'm very sorry. Thank you very much. It's been great, and I wish everybody well. Thank you.
Roger, I'd also like to just come in for a second here. And especially when we are thanking, I think, of course, there's lots of people who've gone in and made this happen. It seemed like pretty stable. It seemed like the ship was floating quite evenly, but there were lots of people actually pushing it along. I would definitely give a shout out to our design team who really did a wonderful job of putting the website together, and also, of course, to Ladyfinger's team, especially Rajasi, whose work has really been a standout and has been unique in kind of connecting all the dots and putting sort of summarizing things that are extremely difficult to do otherwise. So really a big shout out to the Ladyfingers team there. And at the same time, I think, of course, the IT team at IHS has done a fabulous job as well. In putting this, in sort of making this look professional without the tech gods falling on us. So that's been really, really wonderful. But of course, I think a special thank you also to Yasho. I think she's really stood out. I think she really took on the role of co-leading it without actually being required to do so. So really she's put really wonderful work. I really would say the films that she's put together, the work that she's been doing consistently across different levels, a really, really good job on that. And thank you, Yasho, for that a lot. And yeah, I think, of course, Roger, to you and the UEA team entirely, Mark, Vasudha, Hazel, you've been a great team to work with. I really sincerely hope that we get more chance to work together and hopefully take this conversation forward. Of course, we've opened a lot of rabbit holes with this one. So hopefully we'll get into some of them over the next few months, years, who knows. So yeah, thanks a lot to everyone and all the viewers from different parts of the world who've taken the time and watched this and contributed to this conversation. We welcome you all to continue this also on the website. We have a contact sheet there, so please do send your thoughts and we'll include them on the website and follow through with the discussion. So thank you all, thanks a lot indeed.